the first part of examining the place that miracles, signs, and wonders play in the establishment of faith in Christianity and Islam ended by concluding that miracles do not make faith impossible. They do add more or less experiential evidence in support of a belief, but it would be too extreme to hold that it destroys faith or makes it impossible altogether. After all, there are still events which have been foretold or predicted in the future that have not come to pass, and so these constitute open areas where the hope of future conditions can exist and where faith resides. It was also questioned whether in the Islamic tradition there is a total void of unusual occurrences, events seemingly incapable of natural explanation that could be interpreted as divinely sent signs and wonders, something which Dr. Akhtar maintained had not, as far as he could tell, occurred in Islamic history since the 7th century on. But an internet search found some surprising instances that seemed to disconfirm Dr. Akhtar's position. Namely, the incorruptible bodies of significant and important personages in Islamic history. The first site relates events that happened in 1932 when the bodies of two of Muhammad's companions were disinterred for reburial as a result of water intrusion in the graveyards where their bodies had been placed. When they were taken out of their graves, they were seen to be still as fresh as the day that they had died, according to the eyewitnesses. Another website dealt with the fresh bodies of martyrs in the cause of the religion who had been killed in battle and whose wounds, though hundreds of years old, still oozed fresh blood. Now, there are some questions about these reports that need further filling in. Among them, the existence of any forensic examination made by medical experts and where they can be accessed by persons interested in studying them further. For the most part, all we have is a personal testimony of a limited number of individuals who claim to have seen these incorruptible bodies, and a few partial pictures lacking much in the way of specific details. The bodies themselves are not on public display, and that's because Islamic law requires that the dead be entombed or buried within a day or so after their demise. So, lacking any clear evidence to think otherwise, we will take the testimony as true. I emailed Dr. Akhtar about these incorruptible bodies, and he was kind enough to reply to my findings, saying that he was unaware of these reports. He wrote, quote, "Does a wholly secular, by which I take him to mean scientifically verified, does a wholly secular explanation suffice? If not, it would mean that God's mode of speaking has changed," unquote, by which I take him to mean that heaven has once again conveyed something of eternal significance to humanity. But even if a natural explanation cannot be given and one inclines towards a supernatural one, why are... I had a glitch. Let me start that again. But even if a natural explanation cannot be given, and one inclines towards a non-natural or supernatural explanation for these events, can we take them as divine confirmation, as proof positive of the claims of Islam, as certain Muslims are quick to see them, that the religion is what it professes to be, the last and final revelation before Allah comes again as a judge on mankind? The problem is that Islam is not the only religion that can claim possession of incorruptible religious figures. There are those in Orthodox Christianity, and in the Catholic Church there is probably a lion's share of them, many of them viewable to the public. Even Buddhism claims such instances within its tradition. This website will give persons who are interested in the subject of incorruptible Buddhist bodies more information. Because this is a subject that is highly problematic, I will not get into the ins and outs of it, but refer the viewer to either Elizabeth Harper's website, where she gives a pretty thoroughgoing, informative, and even entertaining rundown on the subject, as well as Joan Carroll Cruz's book, The Incorruptibles. Now, if someone were to scroll through the pictures on the internet of incorruptibles, they might wonder how in heaven's name some of them could have been worthy of the title. The reason is that incorruptibility is not always permanent. For some it was years or decades, even centuries, before the laws of nature took over. But for sure, in most of these, if not all cases, the process of decay and corruption went far more slowly than one would expect under the circumstances in which these bodies were placed. Incorruptibility, whether temporary or permanent, is not seen by the Church as an infallible mark of sanctity, and that is why the Church lists these as preternatural rather than supernatural signs. The term preternatural is used to indicate a kind of middle position between the natural, where causes can be physically determined, at least in principle, if not in practice, all the way up to the supernatural, where there is more than sufficient evidence to conclude that something truly came from a divine source. In the preternatural, the cause is not as clear. There is still elements of doubt involved in whatever decision one makes about the evidence that is available. Yes, there is something unusual in the preternatural, possibly an indication of favor from sources whose provenance is not as clear as inquiring minds might like, but there is the question as to whether the event rises to the level of a divine testimony as to the saintliness of the individual, much less the truth of the religion to which that person belongs. There may well be other dynamics operating in such instances of which science is still unaware. For the Church, incorruptibility must be accompanied by other more significant factors than simply the incorruptibility of a body. We can take the astounding story of Bernadette Soubirous as an example, probably one of the better examples we could choose, who was clearly, as we will see, an incorruptible. Here is Bernadette's body lying underneath the altar of the chapel of the religious order which she professed as a young woman. Bernadette was born in 1844 in Lourdes, France, in the southwest part of the country, and died in April of 1879 at the age of 35. She was first exhumed in 1909 as part of the beatification process. It was noted that her rosary that she had been buried with and it was wrapped around her hands had rusted through, and her habit had deteriorated. The good nuns, in changing her habit, washed her with a solution that was a bit caustic, and so it discolored the skin. As a result of this, a very thin film of wax was placed on her face and hands to make her appear more like she was when she was first exhumed. The second exhumation occurred in 1919, and the final one in 1946, 67 years after her death. At the final one of these, Dr. Comte, who was the major overseer of a group of physicians that examined her body, concluded that it was completely intact, did not seem to have putrefied in any way. There was no decomposition of the cadaver at all. He was very much amazed at the condition of the internal organs. And everyone who knows anything about the mummification process of the Egyptians knows that the first thing that was removed from a cadaver were the organs. These were the softest of all the parts of the body, the first to decay, and if they were not taken out immediately, they would soon have a detrimental effect on the preservation of the rest of the body. He notes this about the liver of Saint Bernadette. It was soft and almost normal in constancy. This is 46 years after she died. I pointed this out to those present, remarking that this did not seem to be a natural phenomenon. That's an understatement, if ever there was one. Talk about medical caution taken to an extreme. But Bernadette's significance does not begin or end with her incorruptible body. There are other factors, more significant ones, and these started some years earlier in February 1858 when she was a 14-year-old girl. Now, there's a great deal of history involved in Bernadette's encounter with an apparition, which later the church claimed was truly the Virgin Mary. However, I'm not going to go into all of those, just hit the high spots that are relevant to this video. She began seeing visions while out gathering firewood with her one of her siblings and a friend, and they noted that while they were in this grotto, this sort of cave-like area, that she began talking to someone who seemed to be kind of elevated, and they couldn't see anyone. So when they went home, they told the parents. The parents got, a bit upset. What was she doing? Was she making up stories and so on? But she was very adamant that she had seen someone and that this person had asked her to come back. Well, every time she did, there were a number of these instances. More and more people followed her to see if they could see anything, which of course they could not. In one of these instances, the vision, the apparition, told her to drink and wash from a spring. But there was no spring around. And so Bernadette began digging in the earth. Well, at this point, family and friends thought that she had lost her marbles and packed her up and took her home. But some of the people that were still hanging around, the curious and the questioning, suddenly noted that out of this shallow hole that Bernadette had dug, water started bubbling. People started filling containers with it. They began to wash themselves with it. And then reports started coming in of individuals who were cured of various illnesses as a result of either drinking or washing in the water. Eventually, these stories began spreading not only through the region, but into the larger cities, and finally to the capital, Paris, as well. And this created a lot of intellectual and political consternation throughout the country, which was still suffering the effects of the French Revolution, where there were many anti-religious elements involved in those occurrences. Still, in spite of a lack of pushback, correction, in spite of a lot of pushback, first from the church, they didn't at all believe this, and it took a while before some of the clergy became convinced that in fact these apparitions were genuine. The stories continued to spread even to the point where in various parts of Europe, replicas of the Lourdes grotto, some of them smaller, some of them pretty much the same size, were put up for individuals who couldn't come to Lourdes itself. Travel wasn't as easy back in the mid-1800s as it is now. One case is really unique. and it involves a man named Pierre de Rudder, a Belgian who in 1868 had a tree crash onto his leg that shattered the bone so badly that doctors considered that it was impossible to take these pieces and put them back in such a way that they could reknit themselves into the original leg bone. Uh, the leg could not be restored. In fact, gangrene had set in, and the doctors were concerned that in order to save Pierre's life, they would have to amputate the leg. Uh, he resisted this, uh, asked to be given enough money by his patron to go to the replica in Ghent, some 40 miles away, which he did with his wife and one of his wife's friends. When he got to the shrine, he wanted to get up and on his crutches make a penitential tour around the grotto, but rather than have to use his crutches, he suddenly was able to stand up on his own and walk as without the need of any kind of aid. It so flabbergasted his wife that she fainted, and when she revived, she had to get the testimony of a friend that in fact what what she had seen actually happened. The leg was completely restored. There is a picture in Dr. Harris's book of Pierre with his pant leg rolled up, showing the leg in now its completely cured condition. Another very remarkable instance occurred to a Madame Rouchel, a 50-year-old woman whose face had been eaten away by tubercular lupus. And if anyone has ever seen a person who has suffered something of this kind of a disease, it's not a pleasant thing to look at. Anyway, she went to Lourdes itself and was often tried to hide so that people couldn't see her in spite of the fact that she bandaged up her face. And during one of the Eucharistic processions, of which there are many at Lourdes, suddenly her bandages fell away. She quickly replaced them, and after the procession went to where the waters were, drank from some of it, and once again the bandages fell onto her prayer book. As she put them back on, she suddenly noticed that her face did not feel at all the way it was before, and lo and behold, her face had been totally restored to the condition that it was before she suffered from the tubercular lupus. Now, these are only two of the some 70 or so officially recognized by the Catholic Church to be divinely caused miraculous cures. There are some 7,000 other inexplicable cures that have been on record since the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared in Lourdes in February of 1858, as attested to in a book, The Doctor in the Face of Miracles, that was written by the Italian Doctors Association. Lourdes is the only Christian shrine to have a medical bureau staffed by internationally renowned doctors and scientists on the site, operating 24/7. It applies 4 criteria for anything to be considered a truly miraculous cure. The facts of the illness must first of all be clearly and correctly established and diagnosed, with documentation from doctors, medical facilities, hospitals, clinics, or whatever. X-rays, cardiograms must be presented whenever it is pertinent to this person's medical condition. The prognosis must be permanent, it's something that was of long duration, or a recent illness that is terminal in the short run. The cure must be immediate, within a 24-hour period, without convalescence, complete and lasting. Can't be someone suddenly feeling that they were cured of cancer and 2 days later or 2 weeks later or whatever, dying from the disease. And if any prescribed treatment was administered prior to coming to Lourdes, it has to be determined that the cure could not be attributed to that prescribed treatment. Along with the recognized cures there are probably several times many more instances of persons who, in Ruth Harris's words, quote, refused to undergo the grueling process of medical and subsequent episcopal investigations, preferring instead their subjective certainty and the empirical verification of families and local communities that they had in fact been miraculously cured. Lourdes used to have very ample testimony of these many unverified cures. Wheelchairs, stretchers, crutches, and other medical aids that had been hung on the grotto walls for years and years. I visited Lourdes in 1948 as about the same age as Bernadette was when she first had her visions, and again in 1952 when there was even a larger quantity of such medical aids hung on the grotto wall. I revisited again 53 years later in 2005, and they were all gone, put to better use than as trophies to the restored health of the once infirmed. One interesting humorous anecdote during that 2005 visit, we went there with a Jewish couple that we had known and been friends with for years, decades actually. And while there, the husband was dousing himself, sprinkling himself with some of the water and drinking it. And I asked him, "What are you doing?" To which he replied, "Hedging my bets." On a more serious note, Ruth Harris's own conclusions of her experiences in Lourdes was as follows. What I saw touched me but did not convert me. Indeed, the open-mindedness and spiritual generosity of the group I went with only confirmed me in my Jewish secularism. The experience, nonetheless, completely changed my approach to the topic. And by writing a book that is neither a Catholic apology nor an anti-clerical tirade, I offer it as a study that differs from previous accounts. This is no naive claim to objectivity, but a statement of intent, however imperfectly realized. I wish to provide a historical context for believers and give non-believers a sense of where the appeal of Lourdes lies. Even Muslim writers have made note of Lourdes as a place of cures. In his book, The Seal of the Prophet and His Message, Said Musavilari writes as follows, that he considers the reports of the cures at Lourdes to be an affirmation of the positive effects of prayers that monotheistic believers can secure. Not only Muslims, but he expands that out to monotheistic believers. He does not, however, go so far as to maintain that these miracles are such in any proper sense, and his hesitancy in doing so is understandable. Were he to consider them such, he would have to question the kind of mixed message God was sending by creating such astounding cures in an area of the world where no Muslims resided and that was heavily populated by Roman Catholics at the time, and still today. Proper miracles should be reserved, it would seem, for his most perfect prophetic community to strengthen its faith and as a sign to unbeliever. If, however, these are not miracles, as Musavilari holds, one cannot imagine but being hard-pressed to offer more remarkable instances. What would he and other Muslims have to say about such events were Lourdes an Islamic shrine rather than a Christian one, and Bernadette a Muslim rather than a devout Roman Catholic? The appearances at Lourdes by the Virgin Mary was, needless to say, not the only instance in which she has appeared to someone. In an article in the National Geographic magazine, which one can hardly take to be a publication of any Christian denomination, there is listed some 2,000 instances of apparitions. Now, many of these have never been examined. It is only the more dramatic ones, you might say, the ones that create more of a stir and a fervor, that are looked at seriously. There is, however, among these 2,000 apparitions, one that was seen by us, if not a million people, certainly close to it, in Egypt, witnessed by both Muslims and Christians. When and where this happened and the outcome of these apparitions is what we will look at in the third of this series.